What would people in 50 years, 100 years, literally 500 years from now, what are they going to think when they look back on the early part of the 21st century? Because when you actually take that perspective, it really, the essence of what's really important today just boils down to its essence. You go, that all this crazy other stuff that's happening to us every day today in the kind of cable news scene, that's all just going to go away. And people are going to think, with clarity, what really was important, what really was meaningful in the early part of this century. Now, when they do that, they're going to see that we are living in an extraordinary moment in history, a seriously extraordinary moment in history. And they're going to see it as essentially, in terms of this country, one of the few times, a rare time in this country's history, where effectively we essentially had to fundamentally reinvent ourselves. Now, America has gone through several kind of reinventions in the past. And every time this has happened, it's happened because of essentially deep structural changes happening, for example, in the fabric of the economy. We're going from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, that kind of thing like that. These things break up the old way of doing things. It just doesn't work anymore. And it forces a new way of actually having to think about how to go forward. The other thing that we actually come up against is unprecedented challenges occasionally. Problems that we've never seen before. And the old ways just didn't know how to solve that. Now, this has happened, like I say, about 4 times previously in American history. And in about the space of about 10 to 15 years, the country goes through this really crazy kind of period of reinvention, where how we do work around the economy, how do we actually organize our society, actually goes through very, very big changes. And I'm going to basically say that we're in one of these now. Now, if you go back to the old kind of, the way to understand this in kind of structural terms, is if you go back to the early part of, say, 1800 to 1850, we had technologies at that time were just coming on that was starting to mechanize agriculture. And we had essentially a different way of doing an economy, a yeoman farmers, kind of a distributed kind of economic society that was actually happening there. By the middle of that century, we started moving into essentially early industrial society, pulling people off the farms and more consistently, starting to actually understand how to organize work around that, again with new technologies, steam and others that were kind of creating that. The early part of the 20th century, we saw another kind of period where we were moving into the big cities. We had electrical motors. We were actually organizing work very differently and organizing our society very differently as well. And then after the war, we actually had another wave of technologies, automotive and big cars and trucking, and we moved to the suburbs, and the whole economy morphed again in that kind of way. We're in another one of those fundamental changes right now. Now, with each of those periods, we've actually watched our politics and our way of life restructure around these things. And so Thomas Jefferson, his first election was the election of 1800. It was they actually called it the Revolution of 1800. There was essentially a whole new decentralized way of managing the economy, but also kind of empowering kind of local farmers as we kind of spread out. Around the Civil War, there was a huge restructuring, not just around kind of the Civil War itself, but land-grant universities, transcontinental railroads, opening Homestead Act, things to open up the West, big new ways of understanding how to do things. Around the early 20th century, the progressive era, we essentially saw a whole reorganization of how are we going to work in big cities and all kinds of different ways of innovation that happened in city planning and all kinds of things, sanitation and all kinds of things that actually rethought how we did it. Explosion of innovation there for about 20 years. And then the last time we really saw this was around the Great Depression of World War II and coming off the Great World War II post-war boom. Now, in every one of these things, I just want to be clear, just not to make it, these aren't partisan things. Both parties play parts. This is a fundamental reinvention that all kind of Americans take place in. There's no good guy, bad guy in these things. This is just kind of, this is what happens. Well, I'm saying we're in one of these now, and we don't really see it in the same terms, and I'm going to actually lay this out to you now. Now, what's going on here that's so fundamental and structural? Well, folks, we are in the biggest technological transformation this country, you could argue, has ever gone through in the speed it's gone through. It's essentially the computerization of everything, and the interconnection of all those computers is a world historical event. That'll be something people will look back to literally 500 years from now as, oh, that's when the world went digital. That is because it allows so many things to be fundamentally reorganized along this digital kind of way. That is a huge shift, but it's not the only shift. Partly because of these technologies, we are now, for the first time in the history of the world, organizing on a planetary scale. All our systems are starting to go global. All the kind of trade and all that, communications, we're just becoming this incredibly interconnected world, the globalization of everything. And on top of that, we've got unprecedented challenges, not the least of which is climate change. We have literally got Climate change and its things that are associated. We're having to start thinking serious about water. I'm coming from California. We just got off a big drought. Pandemics like Ebola, mass migration from the Middle East. Global terrorism still hasn't figured out. Super empowered individuals, and now nuclear weapons getting around. Rising inequality around this. Healthcare is not, obviously we're having this huge debate on how to go forward on healthcare. The old way is not working. Education isn't up to speed yet. Retirement, how are we going to really take care? This is classic of a system change. The old systems aren't working. The new systems haven't quite been figured out. So whether we like it or not, we are living in this time of fundamental reinvention.